Thanks, everybody. It was very nice of you to come out tonight. And the topic of this last lecture, I thought about this for a while because it's a little bit daunting to think about it being your last lecture. So I decided that what I should talk about was suffering. Yeah. Yay! That sounds fun, doesn't it? You can leave if you want. I won't be insulted. It'll be all right. I hope that this will be something of a conversation and not entirely just a lecture. I'm going to tell you some stories, and I hope that they'll sort of spark off of each other and a few other things that I might say and spark some ideas in you or give you a new thought, which I hope that if that happens, you will remember that thought to say when we talk about things more at the end, because I would like to hear what you say. The first story is a story from my life, or a period of my life, and the second story is a bit of the story of Mother Teresa, who was recently canonized as a saint. And the third story is a fairy tale from Denmark called The Green Knight, which I'm going to tell to you at some length. But I'm going to start with my story. So I spent a good part of my 30s with major depression. It seems to have been triggered by motherhood, although it lasted much longer than most postpartum depression lasts. I'll tell you that a lot of good things happened to me in my 30s, not the least of which was having my son Sam, who was a delightful child, a child that my husband Rex and I had planned for and wanted and were thrilled to have, as we are still thrilled to have him now that he is 14 and no longer a child. He's a delightful teenager now. For me, depression manifested itself in a variety of ways. There was a lot of crying and some crankiness. And I'm fortunate that my husband, Rex Rimple, is a social worker, and so he was able to diagnose my condition as depression probably a lot sooner than I ever would have on my own. So that was fortunate. Sort of indicative of my stubbornness to not acknowledge this is that one time sometime in my mid-30s, I was teaching creative writing here, and I was, as I am wont to do, having them do a goofy activity, and they were supposed to draw a map of their lives. So I had passed out these big 11 by 14 pieces of paper, and that was the whole instruction: draw a map of your life. And so they were all doing different things, and I had a slightly longer life than many of them. So I had used the front side, and I flipped my paper over, and I was drawing on the back. And when I looked at my paper after I was done, I was like, oh, look, I've drawn an enormous desert. And over here, there were like 3 straggly little plants. And I thought, Lenae, that doesn't seem good. Right? So it was, when I was depressed, I was still going through the motions of my life, but it was like a cardboard Lenae was doing those things. And the real Lenae wasn't there. She was somehow hibernating like some little deserty creature under the sand, perhaps. And it took a number of interventions, like medication and years of therapy and a spiritual director and some shifting things in my life before I sort of recovered from that long period of depression. And that period of depression wasn't my first experience of suffering. Of course, it's difficult to get to be 30 without having some sort of major grief happen to you. But it was this prolonged, difficult experience that I couldn't solve easily. I couldn't, for example, just give up being a mother, and I didn't want to. Even when I didn't feel the joy of motherhood, I still believed in it. And being a mother is, for me, a grace and a joy, but it didn't always feel that way. And that was a struggle, and that was a surprise for me. The other nifty thing that having had a bout of mental illness like depression brings is the idea that it might happen again. And although I do feel like I've acquired some tools that make me more resilient and less likely to be susceptible to that than perhaps I had been, I don't know, it could happen again. And even if it doesn't, I do know that some sort of suffering is going to happen to me again. Spoiler alert, suffering happens to all of us. It will happen to you, it will happen to me, it will happen to the people that we love. That's just how things are down here on earth. But I also know that we aren't alone in that desert experience. So, what do you all know about Mother Teresa? She's a saint. Yes, good. What else? Calcutta, India. That's where she worked. Mm-hmm. Compassionate. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Good. Well, she was with an order of sisters that were working in Calcutta, and they were teaching. It was a teaching order. And she was there for more than a decade before she promised Jesus in 1942 that she would not refuse him anything. 4 years later, after 17 years of teaching, she began to have these mystical encounters with Jesus. She called him the voice, so she heard him speaking very clearly to her, and he told her explicitly that she needed to start doing this ministry to the poorest of the poor on the streets of Calcutta, rather than teaching. That was in 1946. In 1948, she embarked on that ministry. And about at that same time, Jesus withdrew from her. And basically, for the rest of her life, another 50 years, she didn't feel Christ's presence in her life. These are some things that these are some excerpts from letters that she wrote during that period. This is an undated letter. I am told God loves me, and yet the reality of darkness and coldness and emptiness is so great that nothing touches my soul. In 1953, she wrote to her spiritual director and said, please pray specially for me that I may not spoil his work and that our Lord may show himself, for there is such terrible darkness within me as if everything was dead. It has been like this more or less from the time I started the work. That was 5 years after she had started. In 1958, she had a 5-week reprieve in which she did feel Christ's presence with her again, but that was all. And when he went away after those 5 weeks, she said she felt like she was entering a tunnel again. And she continued with what she called spiritual dryness until 1997 when she died. So it was nearly 50 years of that ministry to the poor, where she felt like she was doing what Jesus had asked her to do and could not feel any connection to Christ. The person who edited this book, this is an interesting book because she asked that her letters be burned or be destroyed upon her death. But because of the canonization process, the letters were kept and read. And the priest that edited this book, I think his argument is that the book is proof of her faith-filled perseverance that he sees as her most spiritually heroic act. And it is certainly, I do think that it is probably evidence of that. I don't know why that kind of suffering would happen. I certainly don't understand why someone who seems to be doing God's work and felt it so clearly, such a specific call, would not have the consolation of feeling Christ's presence with her. This is one of the mysteries of our world, and I often talk about sort of facetiously that there are many mysteries, but there are many mysteries, and this, I think, is one of them. if nothing else, I wanted to tell you these two stories because I think that they complicate the sometimes tidy, perhaps too tidy story that we can hear sometimes, that if we follow God's call, all will be well for us. But all may not be well for us. And it's probably good to know that. If you don't know that, then when you run up against suffering, it may seem like you are doing something wrong, and that we're not following God's call. But I know without a doubt, for example, that my son Sam is a blessing to me and to the world. That's not rocket science. Like, everyone can probably just tell how awesome he is. Right? Being a wife and a mother with these particular people in this particular family is part of God's call for me. That's very clear. But that doesn't mean that this is a role that I can inhabit without suffering in it. And that is a mystery. Fortunately, Christianity offers us a particular lens on suffering, which is unlike any other lens that the world has to offer. Because Jesus came and suffered and clearly didn't do anything wrong, he's the ultimate example of the innocent person who suffers. Like Mother Teresa and like me, Jesus went through a desert experience, spending 40 days in what was, for him, both a literal and figurative desert. And then, of course, Jesus suffered crucifixion and all the events leading up to crucifixion. All will be well.
My bad, guys. I fixed them not well enough, clearly.
That's good, though. In any case, the example of Jesus' suffering offers this counter-narrative to this still pervasive and completely pagan idea that when a person suffers, it must be his or her own fault. You can see Jesus argue against that idea overtly with the Pharisees, who ask him if the blind man is blind because of his sin or his parents' sin. Jesus didn't get involved in that blame game. He just helped the man to see. And he tried to help the Pharisees to see, to heal them from their metaphorical blindness, which was harder. Because Jesus suffered here on earth, we can trust that he has a special compassion for us in our suffering. And he is present with us. He understands. Even when Mother Teresa couldn't feel his presence, I believe he was still present with her. Although I can't pretend to understand how that worked or why. But this leads to some important and comforting conclusions. Like, when we suffer, it's not because God hates us. It sounds sort of funny, and I don't know that I consciously sort of thought that, but I certainly felt that. I certainly wondered that when I was in the midst of my depression. Yeah. But we know God loves us all the time despite our sin. And we know that because God sent Jesus to be present with us here in this fallen world. I guess the other point that I maybe have already made, but here it is again, is that when we suffer, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have chosen the wrong path. Sometimes, it's not like it's a sign from God. God doesn't make us suffer to prove a point. However, sometimes we do suffer because we're doing something wrong. Like, there's all sorts of ways we can increase our own suffering by doing stupid and mean things, right? You all know what these things are. We can increase our own suffering that way. We can increase the suffering of others. We should not do those things. That's just my little caveat there. But sometimes suffering sort of comes to us and it's not our fault. I'm going to tell you a fairy tale next. And fairy tales are not necessarily as instructive as biblical texts, but they often point towards things that are true, and in a way that is maybe more clear than ordinary stories, and sort of more archetypal than our ordinary lives. So here we go. A king and a queen had a daughter. And they loved each other very much. The family was quite happy and healthy, and everyone was good until the mother got sick and died when the princess was still a child. And so the princess grew up to be a more melancholy child than she might have been otherwise if her mother had lived. But she and her father still loved each other, and the daughter sought solace in nature. She liked to take long walks in the woods, and she liked to read things. She read quite a lot of poetry, so that was good. There was a countess who lived nearby who had a daughter about the same age as the princess, and they would often get together and play, and the countess's daughter was particularly kind to the princess and would let her choose the games, and they could do whatever activity she wanted to do. And the countess also doted on the princess and was very nice to her. And soon they became the princess's best friends. The king, who was also lonely, saw that his daughter was close to these people and thought maybe this would make a good family for us. So he married the countess, and they became a family. But after that happened, everything changed. The countess's daughter was jealous of the princess. The countess wanted things for her own daughter that the princess had. So eventually, the princess's life became quite miserable. Her stepsister would make fun of her and be mean to her. The countess was, sort of a backstabbing mother, not kind. And the king noticed this. He wasn't blind, and he didn't really feel from a kingly position that he could just get a divorce right away. But he decided that he should send his daughter, the princess, to live in the summer castle, where she at least wouldn't be with the step family, and she could be perhaps happier. So that worked out fairly well. The princess could wander in the garden. She could read, and she grew up to be a fairly typical teenager. She liked to read British romantic poetry. She had a lot of angst. She had noticed, right, that here she was a princess, and things weren't going that well for her. She was still upset about her mother dying, and then the betrayal of the countess and her daughter, and then the general angst of the world, right? Things were not right. And so she was sort of living in that angsty teenage world when her father came to talk to her and say goodbye before he went on a long visit, because there was going to be a big gathering of royalty. All the royalty of that part of the world were going to gather. So he came to visit her, and he could see she was depressed, and he was trying to cheer her up. So he said, maybe you're about old enough to get married. Maybe I'll find an eligible prince when I'm with all the other royals. Any particular things you're looking for in a guy. And she said, Father, only the Green Knight could relieve my suffering. She'd been staying up late. She'd stayed up very late. She'd been reading some Byron the night before. And she was into symbolism. She was practicing. And so what she meant by the Green Knight was not like a literal green knight, but she meant like, the green mounds in the churchyard, the graves. Like she was looking for death. Death would come and relieve her suffering. But her father didn't get it. He thought it was an actual knight, as fathers do, this misunderstanding. And she was like, that's so stupid, I'm not even going to say anything. But it's just another moment that shows how wrong the world is when our parents can't even understand us. So her dad was like, okay, honey, I'll ask around and see if I can find him. And she was like, oh my goodness, okay, bye. So the king went off, and he traveled all this way to the gathering of royals, and he kept asking about the Green Knight, and no one had heard of the Green Knight. It was ridiculous. And, eventually he gave up. And, they finished their meeting, and he headed home, and he had to go over high mountains. He had to cross big rivers, and he was going through dense forest. And all of a sudden, he came to this enormous valley that was full of pigs. Sure. And he's like, what's going on with the pigs? But he saw a herdsman over here, so he went and asked the herdsman, what's going on with these pigs? Whose pigs are these? And the herdsman said, well, they belong to the Green Knight. And the king said, oh, I've been looking for him all over the place. Where does he live? And the herdsman said, well, I don't actually know, but if you go 3 days' ride that way, there will be another valley with another herd of animals, and that herdsman probably knows where the Green Knight lives. So the king rode those 3 days and got to the next valley, and the next valley was even bigger, and it was full of oxen and elk. Yeah, I don't know why. And it's a Danish tale, I don't get it. And there was another herdsman, and so the king was like, are these the Green Knight's animals? Yes. Where does he live? I don't know, but there's another valley, 3 days. Okay. So the king goes, next valley is full of deer. And this time, the herdsman said, I do know where the Green Knight lives. It's only 1 day's ride that way. So the king went that way, on a green trail, through the green woods, to a castle that was entirely green, and people clad in green came out to meet him. And he got to introduce himself to the Green Knight, who he was ecstatic to meet. And he said, I've gone a long way out of my way to find you, but I have a message from my daughter, which is that only you can ease her suffering. And the Green Knight said, that seems weird. I don't know your daughter. She could never have heard of me. The Green Knight was quite a bit younger. He knew some things about suffering, and he had also recently been reading British Romantic poetry. So he said, I bet that what she meant by the Green Knight was the green mounds in the churchyard, like death, So he sort of explained it, worked through the things to the king, and the king was like, oh, well, sorry. And the king was then a little bit nervous and thought he should go home and check on his daughter and see how things were, because clearly things were worse than he had thought. But the knight said, you went a long way out of your way, and I would like to help your daughter ease her suffering. So here's a book, and if you take this book to the daughter and have her sit in the window facing east and open the window in the evening, she can open the book and read it, then that might help ease her suffering. So the king went right away home. He had to go back the 9 days by the valleys. Headed home, went straight to the daughter in the summer palace, and told her that he'd had this encounter with the knight. To which she was like, "Oh my gosh, so mortifying, Dad." And the king was like, "Well, he sent you a gift," and she's like, "Oh my God, good grief." But it was a very lovely green little book. So the king, said hello, goodbye, and then went back to his main castle. Well, that evening, she thought, okay, I've got this book. This is totally embarrassing, but I'm going to try this. She sat in her window, she opened it, she opened the book, and she began to read. And this is what the words were not in a language she recognized, but somehow she could read them, and it was poetry, and here were the lines. The wind has risen on the sea, and bloweth over field and lea. And while on earth broods silent night, who to the night her troth will plight? That is very, very bad poetry. However, I feel like we should give them some slack because it was probably translated from the Danish. So, in any case, as soon as she read that first line, the wind had risen on the sea, she could hear the waves around the island, pick up. And bloweth over field and lea. She could hear the wind blowing through the fields. And while on earth broods silent night, when she read that line, everyone on the island fell asleep, except for the princess. Who to the night her troth will plight? Well, she read that line, and an enormous bird flew in her window, landed, and turned into the Green Knight. She was a little surprised. But he introduced himself, and he was really nice. And he's like, I heard you were having sort of a bad time, so I thought I'd come and say hi. Maybe you'd like to tell me your story. And it turned out that she did want to tell him her story. So she told him all about how her mother died, and then the betrayal of the countess and her daughter, and how things were not right in the world, and parents don't understand their children, and all those things. And he listened very kindly. And they had actually a long conversation. He talked some, she talked some. Eventually the night was almost over. They hadn't gotten any sleep, and he said, okay, it's probably time for me to go, and I'll explain how this thing works. Every time you open the book and read the lines, these same things will happen, and then when you close the book, I will disappear. So now I'm going to transform back into a bird, fly out the window, you close the book, and I'll be gone. So that's what happened. And the next night, she sat at the window and opened the book, and the Green Knight came to visit her in the form of the bird and transformed, and they had this lovely conversation. And this went on for quite some time. And she became much happier, noticeably happier. The staff were thrilled. They didn't know what was going on, but they were very pleased. They sent word to the king, who was also very pleased. Everyone was very pleased except the Countess. The Countess had sort of secretly been hoping that the princess would just waste away from grief and die. And then her daughter would be the only person left to inherit the throne. So the Countess, when she found out about this newfound happiness, was like, I need to investigate this. So she sent her lady-in-waiting to the summer palace. And the lady-in-waiting followed the princess around all day. It was pretty annoying. But as soon as the princess sat down in the evening and opened the book and read the words, she fell asleep. So she didn't know what happened, but the next day she went back to the queen and said, well, I fell asleep probably at the important part, but it seems like something is going on with the book and the window. So the queen said, okay, well, I'll send my daughter to investigate. So she sent the daughter. Of course, the princess was not that pleased to see the daughter, so they went through an awkward day of being more or less polite to each other, la, la, la. But in the evening, when she sat down with the book, of course, the same thing happened, and the daughter fell asleep. She went back and had nothing more to tell her mother than what the lady-in-waiting had known. So the Countess herself said, okay, I'm going to go. And so she went, which was even less great for the princess, but followed her around all day, except for one moment when the princess was busy doing something, and she went to investigate the window. And she noticed that it was like several stories up, but there were these sturdy vines that were going all the way up to it. So somebody who was pretty active and strong, a guy, could maybe scale these vines. So the Countess is like, oh, it's probably an illicit tryst that's making her so happy. It's the way that the Countess's mind worked. So what she did was she took some scissors that she had, and she apparently carried vials of poison around, because that's what you do if you're a mean countess. And she put them on the tips of the scissors and hid them among the vines by the window with the points sticking up in the poison, so they would scratch anyone who crawled in the window. And then she vowed to stay awake, but of course, as soon as the princess read that third line, she fell asleep like everyone else, and the Green Knight came. Now, he came in the form of the bird, so he flew in, and he was too high up to get scratched on the way in. And they had their normal sort of night, and no one noticed the scissors, and it was all fine. The princess had quite a lot to say because, she had to spend all day with her stepmother. When it was time to leave, the Green Knight turned back into a bird, but this time he flew a little lower on the way out, and he scratched himself across the tip of the scissors as he went. And he felt the poison enter him. He's in the form of the bird now. And he let out a cry, and the princess was alarmed, and she stood up, and as she stood up, the book fell off her lap and closed, and he disappeared. Well, of course, the princess sat right back down, opened the book again, read the lines, but he didn't come back. So then she was very worried, and she spent the whole day worried. But the Countess, when she woke up and saw how worried the princess was happy. And she went to the window and found the scissors and saw that there was blood on them, and she put them back in her pocket, and she went home very satisfied. Well, every night the princess tried to read the poem again and tried to bring the Green Knight back, but he didn't come. And she was devastated, and she stopped eating and was sick, and nothing was good anymore, and all she would do is go out and sit in the garden on a bench under the tree and just stare at the sky and think about nothing. It was terrible, and everyone was very sad except, of course, the Countess, who was hiding it. So this went on for weeks, and one day when the princess was sitting in the garden bench under a pine tree, 2 ravens flew down and landed on the branch above her. And as is common in fairy tales, for reasons unknown, they began to talk to each other. And I have their dialogue here. The first raven said, "Isn't it a pity to see the princess grieving to death for her beloved?" And the second raven said, "Yes, especially since she's the only one who can cure him of the wound inflicted on him by the poisoned scissors of the Countess." And the raven said, "How so?" And the second raven said, "Well, the cure is the same as the poison. So what she needs to do is go to the main castle, and there, past in the west courtyard, past the stable, is a big rock, and under the rock is a nest of adders. And what she needs to do is take the 9 little adders, right, these poisonous snakes, and take them to the Green Knight and make him soup for 3 days, and each night the soup should have 3 of the little adders in it." So, and then the ravens flew away. So at that point, the princess realized 3 things. She realized, 1, that ravens knew all kinds of things that were going on. And 2, that she was in love with the Green Knight, which she had never really realized before. And 3, that she needed to make a plan. So she went to her room and made a plan. And that evening, when everyone was asleep, she's just regular sleep, not the poetry sleep, she went down to the edge of the water and she got in a boat and she started rowing across to the mainland, to the castle. Now, as I said, she was weak and sickly. She hadn't been eating much, right? So it was kind of a struggle to do this all-night rowing thing. But she did what she needed to do, and she got there. And then she went straight to the west stable, the courtyard beyond it, big rock, moved the big rock, and then she managed to deal with catching 9 young adder and putting them into her apron. She tied them up in her apron. And then, without saying anything to anyone, she left in the direction that her father had come from when he had come from the Green Knight. And she had to, of course, wander through the thick forests, cross the terrible rivers, summit the mountains, all of that. And finally, weeks pass, finally she comes to a valley full of pigs, right? So she gets directions from that herdsman to the valley full of wild oxen and elk, gets directions from that herdsman to the valley full of deer, and then she walks on the path, the green path, through the green woods to the green castle. Now, she's been walking for weeks at this point, and you would think that she would have had a good plan, but the best she had come up with was begging the cook to let her help in the kitchen. So she went and did that, but she was filthy, and she smelled something awful, and she had something squirmy in her apron, and the cook was like, no. But she begged and pleaded and begged and pleaded. And finally, he was like, okay, I have this really big stack of nasty, dirty dishes with baked-on stuff on them, and you can work on that. We'll see how it goes. I probably won't lose anything in this deal. So she cleaned those dishes till they were sparkling, and finally the cook was like, okay, that was pretty impressive. Take a bath, and you can come back tomorrow. So she came back, and soon she was such a hard worker that she was indispensable to the cook. Now, in the castle of the Green Knight, things were not going well. Everyone was very sad because the Green Knight had been sick for several months, ever since he, returned. They didn't know where he went, but ever since he came back. And they had hired doctors from all around the world to come and give him the best remedies they could, but nothing worked. The cook was beside himself. He knew soup was a healing thing, and he had been making different kinds of soup, a new kind of soup each day for months, and he was exhausted and sad. And so eventually, the princess volunteered one day to make the soup. She said, please let me make the soup for the Green Knight. I have this new recipe I could try. And the cook was like, okay, I'll just take the day off. I haven't had a break for months. So she made the soup that day and sent it up. and the Green Knight ate it, and he recovered so much that he could talk intelligibly. He hadn't been able to talk since then. He'd been lying there with a fever and just incomprehensible garble, but now he could speak. And the first thing he said was, "That was really great soup. I'd like that again tomorrow." So the next day, he went, or the princess made the same soup, right? I would like to point out at this point that the adders were no longer young. This is one of these mysteries of fairy tales. Like, how did it work that the adders hadn't eaten each other in the apron? I don't understand. But anyway, she still apparently had the adders. And so this is the second group of 3 adders in this soup. And when she fed him the soup, or not she, when it got fed to him, he was so well recovered that he could get out of bed. And everyone was, just overcome. And he was like, "I would like that soup again tomorrow." So the next day, she made him the soup again with the last of the adders. And this time, he felt entirely recovered after he ate it. And he ran downstairs to the kitchen to thank the cook in person. And when he got to the kitchen, the only person there was the scullery maid, who was, of course, the princess. And she didn't look like the princess. She was wearing those rags, and she was in this totally different place and all that. But he recognized her, nonetheless, right away. And he said, "I'm so glad you're here." And she said, "I have something to tell you." And he said, "I have something to tell you." And they both said, "I love you," at the same time. And then they said, "Will you marry me?" at the same time. And then they said, "Yes," at the same time. Yes. And I have to get this right. So they soon had a wedding in the green courtyard of the green castle by the green woods, and the princess and the Green Knight lived well through happiness and grief all the rest of their lives. The end. Thanks. So there's a few loose ends here, like there are with some fairy tales. Like, did the princess ever see her father again? What happened to the countess and her daughters? Her daughter, I mean. Why did the Green Knight have so many pigs? But let's set those questions aside for a moment. One of the reasons I like this fairy tale so much is that it has this plucky protagonist who overcomes some serious obstacles and manages in the end to live an authentic, satisfying life. She has a lot of help, a father who loves her, a relationship with the natural world that allows her to hear and understand Raven's speech, the solace of reading, which is no small solace, the respect of the cook, and of course the presence of the Green Knight, who is willing to both talk and listen to her. But she also does what needs to be done. And once she knows what that is, she doesn't hesitate, even though it's not easy and she's unprepared and she doesn't know what to expect. I think it's important to hear stories like that. I think that that kind of story lends dignity to our struggles to do what needs to be done in the face of suffering. I also think it's a decent metaphor for the kinds of things that might need to be done. Facing our own grief and brokenness and pain, as we must do when we find ourselves suffering, is really an epic task. It can feel like rowing all night, or summiting a high mountain, or sleeping in the forest by yourself, all while carrying 9 young adders tied in your apron. Fairy tales also give us hope. This is what J.R.R. Tolkien called the consolation of the happy ending, which he argues is what adults need from fairy tales. Doesn't matter as much to the children, but the adults. Eventually, the princess arrives at the Green Knight's castle. Eventually, she's reunited with her love. Eventually, her own individual suffering becomes less devastating than it once was. As Christians, we can be assured of our own eventual happy ending that Christ has already won for us. That doesn't mean, as I've already said, that we won't experience real and tragic suffering that matters. But it does mean that the suffering is not the end of the story. So I've talked a lot now, which I think is fair, as this was advertised as a lecture. But I'd like to hear some of your thoughts about any of these stories or about suffering or your understanding of suffering. I'd like to hear if you had any new ideas or if this sparked any thoughts for you. Yeah.
How do you deal with suffering that's put on you from other people?
Yeah. That is an excellent question. I mean, sometimes, yeah. That is an excellent question. I mean, sometimes you have to think to yourself, is it part of my calling somehow to be in this relationship with these people? Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. There's so many times, and I think this is maybe part of my point, that just because there is suffering doesn't necessarily mean that something is wrong, although sometimes suffering is a clue that something is wrong. So your discernment has to be more fine-tuned than just, is this easy or not? Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, it might depend on the kind of suffering. What do you think?
I think it takes a whole bunch of forgiveness
Mm-hmm.
and just kind of surrender, and kind of what you said, just use that suffering
Mm-hmm.
as a fuel to I know you hurt me, but I'm gonna use that for good,
Mm-hmm.
somehow
Mm-hmm.
redeem it.
Mm-hmm.
Even though because I know at times we'll hurt people without meaning to, or
Mm-hmm.
we'll mean to, but you
Mm-hmm.
can still turn around for good, or just something like that.
Right, right. I do think that, I don't think that God sends us suffering to prove a point of any sort, but I do think that God can always work in our suffering to bring about good. Yeah, but I don't mean that to say that you should stay in a bad situation that you can get out of, if you think it's. I mean, yeah, there's some kinds of suffering that you should not put up with. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I thought it was really significant that the princess could only get better somewhat as she stayed in her own circumstance, in her own bedroom, but it was in the selfless act of going to take care of someone else
Mm-hmm.
when she felt bad.
Mm-hmm.
And that really resonates with me, because oftentimes the thing I need to do is stop wallowing in my own
Mm-hmm.
feeling sorry for myself
Mm-hmm.
and do a selfless act for someone else. He needed her. She could do that. And she
Right.
got better and stronger from the rowing, but also the dishwashing and the serving.
Right.
And it took time, and she probably didn't even realize that it was happening.
Right.
But just that making myself do for someone else.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think often turning towards other people and helping them bear their suffering is one of the best ways to help heal your own
Yes.
suffering. Yeah.
And kind of going off of that, it tells a really good point that we can help others even though we're suffering ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
She went to him while she was still
Yes.
very, very weak and sickly,
Mhm.
and still she made the point of going towards him anyway,
Mhm.
because she knew that that's what she needed to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Nicely said. Mm-hmm. Stephanie.
And I think just going off of both of those comments too, Mother Teresa, looking back at that story and seeing that she left a place where, she was teaching for years and probably had joy doing that too,
Mhm.
and going into the suffering of these people, these children that she was working with. Must have been an amazing,
Mm-hmm.
experience just to step into their world
Mm-hmm.
and serve them. So possibly she got some joy,
Mm-hmm.
even though she didn't feel the presence of Christ with her
Mm-hmm.
the whole time. There was some kind of joy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good.
I think the king, what he does, gives a good example of what we're supposed to do when others around us are suffering.
Mhm.
The scripture says we're supposed to bear with one another in
Mhm.
suffering, and a lot of times we wonder, what do I do when I'm in suffering? But I think an equally important question is, what do I do when my brother or sister is suffering, and what can I do to help them?
Mm-hmm. Right. Right. And just that sort of that being present with each other can, even if you can't fix somebody's situation, and you can't solve somebody else's suffering, but just being there with them can be a really healing thing. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes, Dr. Willett.
The poetry in the story does what poetry does in real life.
Uh-huh.
That it makes her awake to the natural world
Uh-huh.
In a different way.
Mm-hmm.
I think we read things about the wind, you end up feeling wind in a different way.
Yeah.
And it gets out of her own headspace. It makes her empathetic,
Yeah. Right.
that way. And it puts everybody else to sleep.
Right. Right. That's right. You should be one among the ones that it awakens. And I think if you take some of those English classes with Dr. Willett or Dr. Brian, you can do that. Shameless plug. What else? Yeah.
I think it was interesting that she went through this period of time where she was by herself at the castle. Like, there was obviously the other people there, but she was alone and kind of in her own mind and trying to fix things on her own. But like once she got the help of others, she saw like tangible improvement and like experienced kind of this getting better gradually.
Yeah.
It just kind of reminds me that like when we go through those hard times of suffering and stuff, like we don't have to go through that alone.
Right.
And it's better to do that with others and have other people help us because like God created us for community. So.
Yeah. Right. Right. I think that's an excellent point. And really, once you're, especially if you're enmeshed in something, if you have a mental illness, like in my experience, it's really almost impossible to get better from that by yourself. You really need other people's help and, trained professionals. Good. Yeah. Yes.
I like the emphasis on like how the princess had the king and the green knight caring for her, and then also it took a combination of others caring for her and her own like going out and like doing something and changing it. So it wasn't just like sitting there being doted on, and it wasn't just like her trying really hard. It was a combination.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Thank you. Yeah.
I think sometimes people think suffering is contagious,
Mm-hmm.
so they want to stay away from it as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and I think that this story highlights that, there were people who weren't afraid to be in her situation because they didn't think it was going to somehow like rub off on them.
Right.
You can help people through difficult times and difficult circumstances, and it's not going to ruin your life.
Right. Yes. Yeah, that's true. I think that's such an important point, and it goes back to my argument about the paganness of that blaming the victim sort of mentality that we often have with suffering, which I think we do sometimes in very subtle ways. For example, I like to come up with reasons that people might be sort of at fault or be different from me when they have some sort of suffering, and that's just mean, right? It's just because I'm like afraid to, like I'm a coward, like I'm afraid to actually feel the pain that they, to sort of feel my share of their pain. So I have to watch myself for that. Yeah, I think that's true. Other thoughts?
Would you read the last line of the tale again, please?
Last line of the tale. And the princess and the green knight lived well through happiness and grief all the rest of their lives. The end.
Not happily ever after,
Yeah.
but they lived happily together through joy and grief.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
And what color is he wearing?
You didn't even know about this story, did you? That's just fate. That's a God thing right there. That's super funny. Good. Any last thoughts? This has been so fun. Thank you so much for coming and letting me talk about this uplifting topic. It's really an honor that you all came. Thank you.
Thank you.